In my last video covering the track meet stabbing, the comment section completely exploded with debate. I read through so many of your thoughts, and many of you rightly pointed out how incredibly polarizing this case truly is, right? It is one of those cases where two people can look at the exact same sequence of events and walk away with two completely opposite conclusions. When you first look at the state's timeline, it looks like an open and shut case of a calculated attack. I see exactly why so many of you felt that way. The initial reports painted a very specific, very direct picture. But as this trial unfolds inside the Collin County courtroom, the defense has brought forward context that completely changes the scope of the proceedings. Today, we are looking at the exact same visual evidence through a completely different lens. We are setting the record straight by breaking down the 85-pound physical mismatch, who actually initiated the physical contact according to the courtroom testimony, and what Texas self-defense laws actually say when you strip away the media headlines. You've seen the state's side. Now let's look at the exact evidence the defense is using to challenge this entire trial. We will present the official arguments from the state and the defense for you. Please view it well. We are absolutely not trying to pick sides here. We just want to show you exactly what the court heard so you can evaluate the raw truth of this case for yourself. If you want the unbiased facts without the media spin, hit subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now so we can uncover the truth together. To really understand the evidence, we have to look strictly at the courtroom facts regarding the timeline and the environment. You can't understand the psychology of this case without understanding the exact setting where it happened. According to court records, it all goes back to the afternoon of April 2nd, 2025. We are at David Kuykendall Stadium in Frisco, Texas. It's a regional high school track and field meet. There are multiple schools there, hundreds of kids, coaches, and parents. Now, if you know anything about spring weather in North Texas, you know the sky can turn dark on a dime. And that's exactly what happened here. A severe thunderstorm rolled in, causing a sudden and chaotic weather delay. We aren't just talking about a light drizzle where they paused the races for a few minutes. This was a severe weather system that forced everyone in the stadium to scramble for whatever cover they could possibly find. People were running to get out of the downpour, and the student athletes naturally moved under the available pop-up canopy tents for shelter. Think about that environment for a second. It was crowded. It was loud with the sound of rain hitting the canvas and metal bleachers. And according to testimony presented in court, it was incredibly chaotic. People were packed tightly together, invading each other's personal space just to stay dry. It is a high-stress, claustrophobic environment. This is where the paths of these two teenagers crossed. 17-year-old Karmelo Anthony, a student athlete from Centennial High School, sought refuge under one of these pop-up tents, but he sat under the team tent designated specifically for the rival school, Memorial High School. Under normal sunny circumstances, maybe this is just a minor breach of track meet etiquette. Maybe a coach just tells him to move along. But in the tight, crowded space of a tent during a severe storm, territorial boundaries became a major issue. According to testimony presented in the Collin County courtroom, this is when a verbal dispute over the seating arrangement began. It was between Anthony and twin brothers Austin and Hunter Metcalf, who attended Memorial High School. According to the details that came out during the trial, Austin Metcalf was actually tasked with the unpaid job of keeping an eye on the tent and its contents for his team. This is a crucial detail that was discussed heavily in the proceedings. He felt a responsibility to manage who was inside that space, even though a coach usually handles that role. Witnesses took the stand and stated that Anthony was asked to leave the area up to 15 times. Let's pause on that number. 15 times. That means there was a sustained, repetitive verbal exchange happening. It wasn't just a passing comment, it was a focused confrontation. But according to the testimony, Anthony remained seated on the metal bleachers. Witnesses described him sitting there with his backpack resting squarely on his lap. He didn't get up, he didn't argue back aggressively at first, and he didn't leave the restricted area. He just anchored himself there. The court was told that the entire confrontation, from the very first words spoken to the moment it turned into physical violence, lasted approximately 2 minutes. 2 minutes is a very short amount of time on a clock, but when you are in a tense, escalating standoff surrounded by people, 2 minutes can feel like an absolute eternity. The tension was building second by second. Now we have to talk about the physical reality of the two young men involved in this dispute, because this physical reality is exactly where the defense is heavily anchoring their entire case. Court records establish a very significant, undeniable physical size disparity between them. This isn't just a slight difference in height or a few extra pounds. It's a massive gap in physical power and presence. Austin Metcalf was a varsity football linebacker. According to the medical examiner's report and the court documents presented to the jury, he stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 215 pounds. This is a young man who was quite literally built for physical impact. He was conditioned for a heavy contact sport. On the other side of this confrontation, you have Karmelo Anthony. Court records show that Anthony stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed just 130 pounds. Wow. When you hear those numbers side by side, it really paints a picture, right? We are talking about an 85-pound weight difference. Let that sink in for a moment. An 85-pound difference combined with a 5-inch height advantage. In combat sports, they have weight classes for a very specific reason. A 10-pound difference is considered significant. An 85-pound difference is overwhelming. And the jury in Collin County is being asked to keep these exact measurements in mind when they evaluate what happened next. This brings us to the core of the trial, how the law views this exact situation based on those facts. When you have an incident like this, the law requires the jury to look at the actions of both parties. First, let's look at the prosecution's interpretation under Texas law. The state is arguing that this massive size difference absolutely does not excuse Anthony's behavior that day. The prosecution emphasized repeatedly to the jury that Anthony was a trespasser in a restricted area. He did not belong under the Memorial High School tent. He was asked, according to witnesses, up to 15 times to leave by the students who were actively managing the tent. According to the state's argument, Anthony's decision to anchor himself in place is the root cause of the tragedy. They argue that by keeping his backpack on his lap, refusing to move, and ignoring repeated requests to leave, he intentionally provoked the escalating tension. The prosecution's stance is firm. You cannot legally claim self-defense when you are the one trespassing and aggressively refusing to de-escalate the situation by simply standing up and walking away. The state is essentially saying that Karmelo Anthony created the hostile environment by refusing to yield the space. On the flip side, we have the defense's interpretation under Texas law. The defense attorneys are telling the jury to look strictly at the reality of that 85-pound weight difference and the physical environment of the tent. They argue this massive physical disparity is the most critical element in establishing what the law calls a reasonable apprehension of fear. In Texas, self-defense hinges on whether a person reasonably believed that force was immediately necessary to protect themselves against the other's use or attempted use of unlawful force. The defense claims that a smaller, seated individual weighing only 130 pounds would naturally and reasonably perceive severe, life-threatening physical danger when boxed in and cornered by a 215-pound varsity linebacker. They argue that Anthony was simply trying to stay out of a severe thunderstorm. He had his backpack on his lap, he was sitting passively, and suddenly he found himself surrounded with absolutely nowhere to retreat. The bleachers were behind him, the crowd was around him, and a much larger athlete was demanding he move. The defense is asking the jury to put themselves in the shoes of a 130-pound teenager in that exact claustrophobic moment. This is what makes this trial so incredibly heavy. We have two families whose lives were forever altered on a rainy afternoon in Frisco. You have the Metcalf family grieving the unimaginable loss of a young man who was just at a track meet doing what he thought was right by watching the team tent. And you have the Anthony family watching their teenager fight for his life in a courtroom, facing the possibility of 5 years to life in prison. I see the pain on both sides. and it is a tragedy no matter how you look at it. As a jury member sitting in that courtroom listening to this testimony, you have to separate the emotion from the raw data. You have to look at the undeniable facts. The police confirmed the location. The weather reports confirmed the storm. The medical examiner confirmed the heights and weights. The witnesses confirmed the verbal argument and the repeated requests to leave. But the law isn't just about facts. It's about the interpretation of those facts. The prosecution is asking the jury to view the tent as a restricted zone where Karmelo Anthony was the clear aggressor by way of defiance. They are framing the 15 requests to leave as 15 opportunities for Anthony to walk away and prevent a tragedy. The defense is asking the jury to view the tent as a temporary, chaotic shelter from a storm where a much smaller kid was bullied and boxed in by a larger athlete. They are framing the 85-pound weight difference as an insurmountable physical threat that triggered a purely instinctual defensive reaction. Before the jury even looks at the security camera footage, before they even hear the police body cam audio, they have to reconcile this foundational setup. Who was legally in the right to be in that space? And at what point does a verbal argument over a bleacher seat cross the line into a situation where a teenager fears for his physical safety? This is the complex, heavy reality of the justice system. It's never as simple as a headline. Now, let's talk about the absolute centerpiece of this entire trial, because this is where the two sides truly collide. The prosecution and the defense are looking at the exact same digital file, but they are telling the jury two completely different stories about what it actually means. The central piece of evidence presented to the jury is the Frisco ISD stadium security footage. When the state stood up in front of the courtroom, they made it very clear that they believed this video was the key to proving first-degree murder, right? They wanted the jury to look at the screen and see a clear, undisputed timeline of an aggressive act. Let's break down the prosecution's interpretation under Texas law. Prosecutors played this footage over and over for the jury, pointing out the movements of everyone involved. They argued that the video shows Anthony consciously entering a rival team's tent, anchoring himself to the metal bleachers, and actively refusing to leave. According to the state's presentation, this wasn't a case of someone just looking for shelter. They argued he was looking for a confrontation. Prosecutors told the jury that when the argument escalated into a fistfight, Anthony intentionally escalated it even further to a lethal level. They stated to the court that he deliberately reached into his bag, pulled out a 3.5-inch folding knife, and executed a premeditated, unexpected strike against Austin Metcalf. In the eyes of the state, the video proves that Anthony brought a weapon to a school event and used it the moment he didn't get his way. They are framing it as a calculated, aggressive response to a basic verbal dispute. I see exactly why the prosecution is pushing this narrative so hard. If you look at it strictly from their point of view, a young man lost his life over a tent seating arrangement, and a weapon was introduced into a situation where nobody else had one. It's incredibly heavy to think about, and you can only imagine what Austin Metcalf's family is going through sitting in that courtroom, having to watch those grainy images of their son's final moments projected onto a massive screen. It treats the subject with a lot of gravity because a 17-year-old varsity athlete never made it home from that track meet. The prosecution wants the jury to feel the weight of that loss and see the knife deployment as an unjustified criminal act. But then the defense stood up and they completely flipped the script on that exact same video evidence. Wow. They didn't just accept the state's version of the tape. Instead, they forced the jury to look at the mechanical reality of how that video was actually captured. Let's look at the defense's interpretation under Texas law. The defense team immediately countered the state's narrative by pointing out the severe limitations of the stadium footage itself. They highlighted to the court that David Kuykendall Stadium uses high-altitude, wide-angle security cameras. These cameras are mounted way up on light poles or the press box, designed to capture wide shots of the entire football field or track lanes. They aren't designed to capture close-up, high-definition details inside a dark, crowded pop-up canopy tent during a severe North Texas rainstorm. The defense argued that when you zoom in on the actual altercation, the footage doesn't show a clear, definitive sequence of events at all. Instead, they called it a hazy, heavily pixelated view that basically just shows a blob of people moving around in the dark. They argued that you cannot clearly see individual hand movements, you cannot see facial expressions, and you absolutely cannot see the exact moment the knife was pulled based on those blurry pixels alone. They told the jury that the prosecution was essentially guessing what happened in the shadows of that tent and asking the jury to convict a teenager based on digital static. If you haven't subscribed to U.S. crime cases yet, make sure to do it now so you don't miss our deep dive into part 3. To provide real clarity on what those high-altitude cameras actually missed, the defense had to rely on something much more reliable than blurry pixels: the testimony of the people who were standing just inches away. During the trial, the defense used witness cross-examinations to completely recontextualize the entire physical altercation. They called the state's own teenage witnesses back to the stand, and under oath, they forced them to recount the exact second the confrontation turned physical. And this is where the defense landed a massive blow to the prosecution's timeline. Under intense cross-examination, those student-athletes admitted to the court that Austin Metcalf actually initiated the physical contact. Witnesses testified that Metcalf delivered a forceful, two-handed shove directly to the seated defendant's shoulders. Think about that for a second. Right? According to the testimony, Anthony didn't stand up and start a fist fight. He was sitting down on the bleachers with his backpack on his lap when a 215-pound varsity linebacker walked up and forcefully shoved him backward. The defense argued that Anthony was trapped against the cold metal bleachers, boxed in by a crowd of rival students with absolutely nowhere to run or retreat. They told the jury that in that exact terrifying moment, pure survival instinct took over a 130-pound kid who felt completely overwhelmed and physically threatened. This testimony establishes the absolute core conflict of the entire trial. We are looking at two completely different realities built from the exact same 2 minutes of chaos. The state views the knife deployment as an illegal escalation by a defiant trespasser who refused to follow simple instructions to leave a team area. They argue that a push does not justify a stabbing, plain and simple. Meanwhile, the defense views that exact same moment as a single, desperate defensive strike by a cornered teenager reacting to a violent physical assault from a much larger, stronger aggressor. To make things even more complicated for the jury, a Frisco Police Department detective took the stand and dropped a major piece of legal information that surprised a lot of people following the case. The detective confirmed under oath that carrying a pocket knife with a blade under 5 inches is entirely legal under Texas state law. Let's pause and really think about the legal implications of that statement. The prosecution had spent days talking about the knife as if its mere presence proved criminal intent. But a law enforcement officer explicitly told the court that Anthony was completely within his legal rights to have that tool in his possession. Now, of course, the prosecution didn't just let that go. They quickly pointed out that while the knife might be legal under Texas state law, carrying it inside a stadium during a school-sanctioned event is a massive violation of school district policy. They argued that Anthony knew he wasn't supposed to have it there, which speaks to his mindset. But the defense countered right back, arguing that violating a school code of conduct is a completely different universe than committing first-degree murder. They argued that when a person genuinely believes their physical safety is in immediate danger, the school handbook doesn't dictate their right to survive an assault. So, you see how deep this rabbit hole really goes? It's a massive legal puzzle. On one hand, you have a tragic loss of life that started over something as trivial as a pop-up tent during a rainstorm. On the other hand, you have a massive size disparity and a documented physical shove that happened right before the fatal blow was delivered. The police said the knife was legal. The witnesses said the football player pushed the seated kid first, but the prosecutors said the seated kid shouldn't have been there in the first place and had been warned 15 times to get out. When you sit back and analyze it like a journalist, you realize just how difficult this is for the 12 people sitting in that jury box. They have to watch a blurry security video, listen to conflicting interpretations from high-powered attorneys, and decide whether a single defensive reaction crosses the line into murder. It forces you to realize that the justice system isn't always about black and white answers. Sometimes it's about trying to find the truth inside a pixelated shadow on a rainy afternoon. We just went through the video evidence and the massive physical differences, but the timeline doesn't end with that single physical strike. In fact, some of the most critical evidence presented to this jury happened in the frantic, chaotic minutes right after the incident, right? If you watch true crime trials, you know that the immediate aftermath of an altercation is usually where the truth leaks out. Before lawyers get involved, before anyone has time to craft a story, raw human reaction takes over. The final major piece of evidence in this trial centers entirely around the post-arrest audio and the eyewitness accounts from the people who saw Karmelo Anthony immediately following the physical altercation. When police arrived at David Kuykendall Stadium, the scene was an absolute nightmare. It was raining, students were panicking, and a young man's life was slipping away on the ground. A Frisco school resource officer was among the first law enforcement officials to encounter Anthony. And thanks to police body cam footage, the jury didn't just have to rely on witness memories to know exactly what was said in those crucial first minutes. The camera captured Anthony right after he was detained. Picture this: a 17-year-old kid in the rain, surrounded by police, being handcuffed and put down on the wet pavement outside the stadium. On the audio played in court, an officer is heard giving him instructions and advising him that he is being detained as an alleged suspect. Anthony's response to that officer is captured clearly on the microphone. He is heard stating, "I'm not alleged. I did it." Wow. That is a heavy, heavy sentence to play in a quiet courtroom. You can imagine the air getting sucked right out of the room when the jury heard that. The prosecution knew exactly how much weight those 6 words carried, and they made sure to highlight them. Let's look at the prosecution's interpretation under Texas law. The prosecution presented this audio to the jury as a cold, matter-of-fact admission of guilt. They argued that this specific phrasing, correcting a police officer to confirm he actually did the act, demonstrates a complete and total lack of remorse following the incident. From the state's perspective, they want the jury to hear a calculated, unbothered suspect. They argued that this audio proves his intent. They're essentially telling the jury, look at him. He isn't panicked. He isn't denying it. He is openly claiming it without a shred of emotion. In a first-degree murder trial, proving intent is everything. The state believes those few words caught on body cam lock in the fact that Anthony knew exactly what he was doing, and he simply didn't care about the consequences of his actions. I see exactly why that looks incredibly damaging on the surface. If you are sitting in the jury box and you stop the tape right there, it paints a very dark, very damning picture of a cold-blooded attack. But the defense did not let that body cam audio stand alone. They knew they had to provide context for that exact moment on the pavement. The defense's interpretation under Texas law completely challenges the state's narrative by pulling the timeline back just a few minutes earlier. They took the jury right back inside the stadium into the immediate aftermath, before the police even arrived and before the handcuffs went on. To do this, the defense introduced statements Anthony made to a school coach right after the strike happened. According to testimony from the football coach who found him, Anthony didn't run off into the city to hide. He was still right there in the stadium, and he spoke up immediately. Anthony stated to the coach, "He put his hands on me. I told him not to. I stabbed him." The defense argued that this statement completely destroys the state's claim of a cold-blooded killer. They argued this proves pure transparency from a panicked teenager who genuinely believed he was legally protecting his own life. Under Texas self-defense law, you have to prove you felt a real, immediate threat. The defense told the jury to really listen to his words to that coach. He doesn't brag. He doesn't sound triumphant. He immediately states the exact sequence of events that the defense has been arguing all along: the physical assault on him, the verbal warning he gave, and his final defensive reaction. When the defense talks about his state of mind here, They are leaning on a powerful psychological reality. When a person speaks immediately after a traumatic event, like Anthony did to the coach, they haven't had time to fabricate a lie. The defense is telling the jury that the kid who said, "He put his hands on me," is the real Karmelo Anthony. They argue that this was the raw, unfiltered truth pouring out of a teenager who was absolutely terrified. Furthermore, the defense emphasized a crucial physical fact about the altercation itself, which was corroborated by the medical examiner's findings. Anthony delivered only one single strike. He didn't engage in a violent, repeated frenzy. According to the defense, he used the weapon exactly once, simply to clear the physical distance so he could escape the 215-pound linebacker who had just violently shoved him. The defense argued that if he was this calculated, aggressive trespasser that the state claims he is, the physical evidence on Austin Metcalf's body would look very different. But a single strike, they argue, is the absolute hallmark of someone who just wanted the physical threat to stop so they could get out of a trapped situation. To back this narrative up, the defense called multiple witnesses who saw Anthony in those specific, raw moments right after the stabbing. This is where the human element really takes over the courtroom. Student witnesses testified under oath that Anthony was seen crying and visibly distraught immediately following the incident. One witness specifically testified that they saw a coach actively comforting Anthony in the bleachers while he was sobbing, right before the police detained him. This directly challenges the state's claim that he was cold and unremorseful, right? You have the body cam audio sounding flat on the pavement, but you have eyewitnesses swearing they saw a terrified, crying kid who had just been in a physical altercation with someone 85 pounds heavier than him. The defense asked the jury to consider how much shock, trauma, and adrenaline play a role in how a person sounds on a police camera 10 or 15 minutes after a life-altering event. People in deep shock often sound flat, disconnected, or matter-of-fact. The defense is saying, do not mistake psychological shock for a lack of remorse. This brings us to the heavy conclusion of the trial's presentation. Both sides officially rested their cases on Monday, June 8th, 2026. After days of intense, emotional, and heavily conflicting testimony, Karmelo Anthony opted not to take the stand in his own defense. In any trial, the judge explicitly instructs the jury that they cannot hold a defendant's silence against them. It is his constitutional right. But as a human being sitting in that jury box, it leaves them with having to piece together his internal mindset based purely on the witnesses, the blurry security video, and that brief body cam audio. They don't get to hear him explain his fear directly. They have to weigh the evidence themselves. The prosecution carries the ultimate burden of proof here. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Anthony did not act in self-defense. They have to convince the jury that Anthony's decision to pull the knife was born out of anger, not fear. They are asking the jury to look at the fact that he was in a tent where he wasn't welcome and that he refused to leave when asked multiple times. The final decision now rests entirely on how these 12 jurors interpret these specific facts under the strict criteria of Texas self-defense laws. They have an incredibly difficult job. They have to strip away all the media noise outside the courthouse. They have to set aside the social media arguments that have torn the community apart. Most difficult of all, they have to somehow look past the profound tragedy of a young life lost and look strictly at the legal definitions of self-defense. We really have to remember the victims in all of this. Austin Metcalf went to a track meet to support his school and never came home. His family has had to sit in that courtroom every single day, listening to the mechanics of how their son died. It is a level of grief that most of us cannot even begin to comprehend. And at the exact same time, Karmelo Anthony's family is sitting on the other side of the aisle, watching their teenager face the prospect of spending the rest of his life in a state penitentiary. Two families completely shattered in the span of a 2-minute confrontation over a pop-up tent. The jury must decide the ultimate legal dilemma. Does a forceful push by a much larger individual in a boxed-in, crowded environment legally justify the deployment of a lethal weapon? Reviewing the official trial records shows exactly how complex the application of the law can be when applied to a real-world tragedy. It is never as simple as a headline makes it seem. The justice system forces everyday people to make impossible choices. They are not just deciding a verdict. They are defining what self-defense actually means in the state of Texas. Is it first-degree murder, or is it a panicked, justified reaction to a physical assault? Based strictly on the physical size disparity we discussed, the initial physical shove by Austin Metcalf, and the single weapon strike by Karmelo Anthony to clear the distance, what is your legal assessment of this incredibly polarizing case? Leave your verdict in the comments below, and please keep the discussion respectful and analytical. Thank you for staying till the end. Subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases for further factual updates as closing arguments proceed.